All right, crew. This is pretty exciting because we're really winding down here. We are going to talk about the different global impacts of the Cold War in the next series of videos. I want to really focus them on geographic regions, so I've rearranged some of the old PowerPoints I put together in previous years, and now I want to focus on how the Cold War impacted different regions. So the first section I want to talk about Asia, and then we're going to talk about Africa and the Middle East next, and then we'll move on to Latin America, and then after that, our last unit slash chapter is on globalization. Then we're going to just shift right over to AP exam review. All right, so the really important nation for us to understand is China, and then I'm also going to add information about Korea and Vietnam. But the major, of course, the largest country in Asia, and the country that is arguably making Western nations the most nervous about the future of capitalism, communism, about the containment theory, about a number of different ideological struggles that are taking place after the war. I think China is really the key target for Westerners. So, if you remember, and if you don't, feel free to look back at the old videos, but if you remember from earlier in period 6, the Qing dynasty collapsed in 1911, and there was a period where China was a republic under Sun Yat-sen, and after that there was a period of civil war between Chinese nationalists or capitalists, the Kuomintang, and then also the Communist Party, eventually led by Mao. If you remember, there is some periods where there's civil war, and then with the Japanese occupation of China, that stops so that both parties can concentrate on focusing on external threats. But then after World War II ends, the Civil War resumes, and by 1949, the communists prevail. Mao Zedong is the leader of the Communist Party, as I said, and he will become the new leader of China. It is renamed the People's Republic of China. And when it is founded, first off, this really spawns a close relationship between China and the Soviet Union. One obvious reason for that is geography. The Soviet Union borders China to the north. Another important element of this bond is that the Soviet Union actually acts to assist China. Hold on, this is driving me crazy. I don't know if you guys see these little bouncing icons. It's because I have my iPad plugged in, so it opens up iPhoto. Anyway, sorry. What was I saying? I was talking about the relationship between China and the USSR. Okay, lovely. So also the USSR is going to be an effective aid for China. It wants to help it gain access to better military technologies. And also, one of the things that we'll see, and we'll talk about this more in the next slide, is that Mao Zedong, again, the head of the Communist Party, he orders the nationalization of Chinese industries, and he also creates 5-year plans, which are very similar to the Soviet model. So the China-Soviet Union relationship is also because China is really trying to emulate the same system that the Soviet Union used when it first became communist. So how exactly does that work? Well, China, or Mao, calls this new plan the Great Leap Forward. And I don't know if you can tell the difference, obviously, between these pictures. This is, hopefully, goes without saying that this is a propaganda poster that's trying to encourage what the Great Leap Forward was doing. So the Great Leap Forward, you can compare it in a lot of ways to Mao's 5-year plan. It started in 1958, and the idea was to reorganize peasant lands. And they were reorganized into collectives, and you can see a portrayal of one of these right here. And what that meant was that the land was owned by the state, and now you had peasants who worked on these communes. Again, all the land would go, none of the land or none of the product that resulted from this work belonged to the peasants in any way. It was all going to the state. And peasants who protested against this new policy were basically sent away. They were sent away to what's called re-education camps, which essentially was like a gulag, except it was located in China. And also this resulted in a large-scale failure. There was a major famine. Critics of the Great Leap Forward called it the Great Famine, and over 20 million peasants die as a result. And again, it's very similar to the reasons why Stalin's 5-year plans don't work. Basically, because people are not in control of their agricultural productions. Since the Great Leap Forward was much more focused on developing industry, this food actually went more towards the urban areas, towards this growing urban working class. The people who actually were farming didn't have access to any of it. So it's very similar to the famine that you saw in the Ukraine. Another thing that Mao does, and this is sort of stereotypical for totalitarian leaders, you could compare it to all the different totalitarian leaders we talked about before World War II. He's also trying to really change the culture of China to prevent opposition and also to fully embrace communism. He knows that in order to have a single party state, he needs to have as much of the country behind it as possible. So the Cultural Revolution starts in 1966, and it was Mao's plan to culturally move China in the direction of a complete communist state. This plan silenced critics and ensured that Mao's hold on power was similar to the purges that Stalin carried out. And so some of the instruments, the most effective instruments of the Cultural Revolution were the people. And Mao started young, so very similar to what you saw in Italy and Germany. The youth in China were educated to be young communists. They took on the title Red Guard, and their goal really was to try to target any opposition to the Communist Party, report them, where they would then be sent to re-education camps. So oftentimes you would actually have students who were pointing the finger at their teachers. They could point the finger at other students. All the Red Guards were trained to take Mao's little red book of communism to its absolute word. Oftentimes these Red Guards ultimately would be responsible to point the finger on people that they were close to. So the idea was, were they more faithful to their state or to their family? In a lot of ways, the Cultural Revolution represented a serious decline in Confucian teachings, which prioritized the family over the state. And that was really a way that Mao thought he could indoctrinate communism into the Chinese people, make them get rid of all their previously held traditions like Confucianism and move in the direction of a communist state. Now, one of the things that Mao didn't consider fully is how long-standing of a tradition this was in China. Of course, we already know that the self-strengthening movement, the 100 Days of Reform in the late Qing dynasty also failed, largely because the Chinese really were steadfast in holding on to their traditions like Confucianism. And so the Cultural Revolution does not have long-lasting effects. Really, it only works when it is strictly enforced by the government. When Mao dies in 1976, we'll pick up with this on the slide after this one, the new leader, Deng Xiaoping, introduces a series of reforms which really cuts back on the severity of the Cultural Revolution, and longer-standing traditions like Confucianism can return safely. Now, one other important thing for us to realize is that even though the Soviet Union and China were very close at the beginning of the People's Republic of China, so in 1949, the Soviets were aiding the Chinese, what we see is that when we move into the 1960s, China and the Soviet Union experience a lot more tension. So one of the things that we see happen beginning in 1961, there are a series of border skirmishes between China and the Soviet Union. The biggest border conflict comes to a head in 1969, where Russia is actually forced to cede this territory in pink to China. So this map is a little hard to make out, but this is a fairly northern region along the Chinese-Soviet border. But it's significant to know that both of these two countries are actually sort of looking towards outsiders to try to encourage unrest and instability within their opposing countries. So what the Soviets do is they try to appeal to the Uyghurs. We know who the Uyghurs were. They were those Western, non-Chinese people who are living in China, mostly Muslim. So the Soviet Union knows if it can get the Uyghurs to rebel against the Chinese, that it will contribute to more inner instability in China. And the Chinese do something somewhat similar, although it's not internal. They look towards Albania. Albania was a Soviet satellite state, but it is removed. It's not directly bordering the Soviet Union. I should have had a better... I don't actually have... Here. Okay, so I'm going to sing and talk at the same time. I just realized it would probably be helpful for me to show you exactly where Albania is. So normally I don't do this, but I'm just going to pull up a map while I talk about it. So Albania, you'll see, is not around the corner from the Soviet Union. It's in the Balkan region, if you remember from World War I. Hopefully you do. Is it not going to find it? Okay, perfect. All right, so yeah, it's in the Balkan region. Remember that it was a cause of some tension leading into World War I. It was created by Austria-Hungary to try to cut Serbia off from the ocean. Fast forward into the Cold War, Albania was part of the Warsaw Pact, was allegiant. This is still happening. It was allegiant to the Soviet Union. And China tries to use that to its advantage. So see how Albania is fairly far removed from the Soviet Union, so it's very difficult for it to have a direct influence over it. What the Chinese do is they take advantage of the fact that Albania is distant from China. With this increased conflict over borders and other issues between China and the Soviet Union, Albania actually decides to take the side of China. China decides to reward Albania for this by giving it some financial assistance to allow Albania to be more autonomous. So essentially, we see that both of these countries are sort of using some other internal or other issues besides the actual direct conflict between China and the Soviet Union to encourage further tension between the two. I'm just going to give up on these little bouncing icons because they don't seem to be going anywhere. All right, let's talk about what happens after Mao dies. So in 1976, Mao dies, and that brings at least a weakening to the Cultural Revolution, and eventually it will come to an end. It's very difficult for a single-party state to try to control people's ideologies, in particular when the new leader, Deng Xiaoping, is a little bit more lenient in terms of how China is going to continue as a communist nation. So in 1981, Deng Xiaoping becomes the new leader of China, and he institutes a series of reforms. They're nicknamed the Beijing Spring. And in some ways, it kind of reminds me of Lenin's new economic plan because it's the introduction of some quasi-capitalist measures into the Chinese economy. So one of the big things that happens is he replaces those commune systems with peasant leased plots of land, and peasants could then grow their own crops and sell part of them in markets. So basically the idea was that instead of all agricultural production going straight to the state, the peasants still had some ownership over it. This also, of course, encourages them to produce a surplus because then they can profit off of it. So the result of the Beijing Spring is actually that there are some agricultural surpluses instead of the famines of the past. But one of the negative, at least from the Chinese perspective, one of the negative results of Deng's reforms was, whoops, this is really driving me nuts today. One of the results of Deng's reforms was that there were actually foreign companies who were allowed to set up some factories in special economic zones along the coast. And so one could say that the Beijing Spring did lead to globalization, which we'll talk about more later on in the year before we close. And the other thing that Deng Xiaoping does that's a pretty dramatic shift from what Mao did was he becomes more open to having a better diplomatic relationship with capitalist countries. One of the best examples of that was in 1979 when Deng Xiaoping went to the United States and met with President Jimmy Carter in Camp David. But we'll see that in terms of, the future for democracy in China, even when Deng Xiaoping is the leader, this does not mean that people have autonomy, sovereignty, anything along those lines. So, the economy experiences some reforms, but in terms of political control, you don't see as much. And the best representation of this, I would argue, is the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. So, what happens here is that with Deng's economic reforms, people start to push for more political reforms as well. So people really are pushing for things like freedom of speech and the press and the end of the Communist Party's monopoly over political power. So, in a lot of ways, we see that the Beijing Spring made some Chinese people think that there would be a possibility for more democratic power in China. Also, you saw that increasingly with this opening of diplomatic relationships to the West, more and more Chinese people were becoming aware of Western practices, about the way their governments were shaped. More Chinese people were just learning about Western democracy, independence movements, constitutions, and so on. And so the Tiananmen Square protest at first, in some ways shows us how willing the Chinese government is to adapt to these changes that some students want. So in 1989, there was a student-led demonstration in Tiananmen Square, which is in Beijing. And it was largely peaceful, but the government responds by force. So it brings tanks into the square to try to break up demonstrations, and in the process, hundreds of people are killed. This is one of the most iconic images of the Tiananmen Square massacre. It shows us a man who's standing in front of these tanks in opposition to the Chinese government trying to mow down the protesters. From a Chinese perspective, you still don't know much about the Tiananmen Square massacre because China censors most of its search engines and social media outlets. And so if you're in China and you do, a Google search on Tiananmen Square, you're going to find out little to no information about the massacre. So most of what we know about it is from the West. But what we see here is that despite Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms, it is certainly not an indicator that China is moving in a more democratic direction for its people. All right, even though we only have 3 more slides, I think I've been talking for a while, and there was all that complication with the Apple products jumping around. So let's take a break here, and then we'll pick up with Korea and Vietnam in just a minute. All right, stay tuned, and thanks.